Some people spend their lives fearing the stranger at the edge of the road. Few ever stop to wonder why that stranger keeps coming back. Every morning, before the first ranch hand stirred a pot of coffee and before the church bell drifted across the sleepy frontier town, Luke Harper heard the same sound. Soft footsteps pressing into the dust beyond his gate. Never hurried, never hidden, always stopping at exactly the same place. When he stepped onto the porch, she was already there. Aiyana, the Apache woman, stood quietly beneath the pale glow of dawn, wrapped in a simple buckskin dress that caught the morning breeze. Her long black braid rested over one shoulder. She carried nothing in her hands. She never called his name. She never crossed the weathered fence surrounding his ranch. She simply looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, only with the calm expression of someone waiting for the day another person finally understood something they had not yet realized. Luke frowned every single time. The first morning, he ignored her. The second, he pretended not to notice. By the fifth, the silence had begun following him long after she disappeared beyond the hills. People in Dry Creek noticed everything, especially things they did not understand. By noon, the whispers had already reached the saloon. The Apache woman keeps watching Harper. I've seen her every sunrise. She's planning something. Nobody visits a white ranch every day without a reason. Rumors spread faster than prairie fire. Each telling made the story darker than the last. Luke tried not to listen. He had spent years building a quiet life with little more than hard work, stubborn determination, and long days beneath an unforgiving sun. The last thing he wanted was to become the center of another frontier tale. Yet every dawn she returned. Always the same place. Always the same silence. One morning, Sheriff Nolan Briggs slowed his horse beside the ranch. You know her? Luke shook his head. Then tell her not to come back. I've tried. The sheriff studied the empty road stretching toward the distant mesas. People fear what they don't understand. So do I, Luke admitted quietly. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode away. The next sunrise arrived wrapped in pale golden light. Luke was already waiting outside before she appeared. For the first time, their eyes met before either of them had fully entered the morning. She stopped. He walked down from the porch until only the wooden gate separated them. You shouldn't keep coming here. His voice remained calm, but firm. The breeze carried his words across the open field. Aiyana listened without moving. This town already believes the worst, Luke continued. Every day you stand here makes things harder. She lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat before lifting them again. There was sadness there, but no resentment, no accusation, only patience. Luke felt strangely unsettled. He had expected an argument, a plea, perhaps even anger. Instead, she simply offered a small nod, turned without a single word, and began walking toward the distant hills. Her figure grew smaller beneath the rising sun until it disappeared into the shimmering heat. Luke remained standing beside the gate much longer than he intended. Behind him, the ranch was quiet. Ahead of him, the empty trail seemed somehow lonelier than it had the day before. He told himself she would not return. He wanted to believe that. Yet somewhere deep inside, he had the uneasy feeling that the real story had only just begun. The next morning, Luke Harper woke before sunrise without knowing why. The habit had become strangely familiar. For nearly 2 weeks, every dawn had begun with the quiet figure standing beyond his gate. Every morning carried the same uneasy silence, the same unanswered questions, the same pair of patient amber eyes waiting beneath the growing light. Today, the road was empty. Only the wind crossed the prairie. Luke remained on the porch longer than he cared to admit. His coffee cooled in his hand. Nothing moved except a pair of meadowlarks gliding over the tall grass. Finally, he shook his head. So that's the end of it, he muttered. He should have felt relieved. Instead, an unfamiliar emptiness settled over the ranch. The day stretched longer than usual. Repairing broken fence posts offered little distraction. Feeding the horses felt strangely mechanical. Even the endless sound of hammer against weathered wood could not silence the image of an empty road beneath the morning sun. By evening, he convinced himself the matter was finished. Until dawn came again. This time something rested against the porch steps. A small bundle wrapped carefully inside clean cloth. Luke frowned. He looked across the empty fields. No footprints. No horse. Only the gentle breeze pushing loose dust across the yard. He knelt slowly. Inside the cloth rested fresh cornbread, still carrying the faint warmth of a nearby fire. Beside it lay several wild herbs tied together with thin strips of leather. He stared for several long moments. No note. No explanation. He glanced toward the horizon. Nothing. He almost left the bundle untouched. Instead, hunger won. The bread was simple, fresh, better than anything he had baked for himself in months. The herbs carried a clean scent he did not recognize. He placed them inside the kitchen without another thought. The following morning, another bundle appeared. This time it contained dried venison. The next day, firewood already stacked neatly beside the chopping block before sunrise. Then a small pouch filled with medicinal leaves. Always before dawn. Always without a sound. Luke became convinced someone was watching the ranch. Not with hostile eyes. With careful ones. At the saloon, the whispers changed. Maybe she's trying to curse him. Or earn his trust. No Apache gives away food for nothing. Luke remained silent. Deep inside, he no longer believed the stories. One rainy afternoon, while riding back from Dry Creek, he noticed something unusual near the cottonwoods overlooking his land. A familiar figure stepped quietly from the trees. Aiyana. She carried another small bundle beneath one arm. Luke guided his horse behind a cluster of cedar trees without making a sound. For the first time, he watched instead of being watched. She approached the porch slowly. Her movements were careful, almost respectful. She placed the bundle beside the door. Before leaving, she paused. Her eyes drifted across the ranch. The repaired fence. The horses grazing peacefully. The smoke rising gently from the chimney. A faint smile appeared on her face. Not pride, not satisfaction, only quiet relief. As though seeing those ordinary things exactly where they belonged mattered more than anyone could understand. Luke felt something shift inside him. Every rumor he had heard suddenly sounded smaller. Every warning seemed louder than the truth, standing only yards away. He waited until she disappeared over the nearest hill before walking to the porch. Inside the cloth rested fresh water carried in a clay bottle. Alongside it lay another small bundle of healing herbs. No message, no request, no expectation, only kindness offered without witnesses. Luke looked toward the distant hills where Aiyana had vanished. For the first time since she appeared outside his ranch, he did not ask himself why she kept coming. Instead, he found himself wondering why she cared whether he was alive at all. Sometimes the smallest thing left behind can pull a man farther than the longest road. 3 mornings passed. No footsteps. No bundles of food. No fresh water resting beside the porch. The silence returned to Luke Harper's ranch, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt unfinished. Each sunrise, he found himself standing outside before the sky turned gold, staring toward the distant hills where Aiyana had always appeared. Nothing. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath the wind. Only dust answered him now. He tried to convince himself that life had simply returned to normal. Yet normal no longer fit. While repairing a broken corral gate one afternoon, Luke caught himself looking toward the road for no reason at all. His hammer paused in midair. The empty trail seemed to be waiting with him. He laughed quietly at himself. What am I expecting? The wind offered no reply. Late that evening, rain clouds rolled across the mesas. A gentle shower settled over the valley, leaving the earth cool and fragrant by dawn. Luke saddled his horse early, intending to check the northern pasture before the creek rose too high. The ground was darker after the rain. Every hoofprint stood clear against the damp soil. Halfway across the meadow, something unusual caught his eye. A single, turquoise bead rested beside the trail. Small, smooth, polished by careful hands. It reflected the morning sunlight with a faint blue-green glow unlike anything naturally found on his ranch. Luke climbed down from his saddle. He picked it up carefully. The leather cord attached to it had been torn, not cut. Someone had lost it recently. His fingers tightened around the bead. For reasons he could not explain, he knew exactly whose it was. He looked ahead. A series of faint footprints disappeared toward the western hills. Not fresh enough to hurry. Not old enough to ignore. Luke stood there for a long moment. The easiest choice would have been turning back. Returning to his fences. Returning to the life he understood. Instead, he slipped the turquoise bead into his pocket. Without another thought, he guided his horse toward the distant ridge. The trail became narrower with every mile. Rolling grasslands slowly gave way to towering red rocks. Cottonwood trees lined a winding stream hidden beneath the cliffs. Birdsong replaced the sounds of the ranch. The deeper Luke traveled, the quieter the world became. Hours passed. The familiar landmarks of Dry Creek disappeared behind him. No wagon tracks reached this place. Only narrow paths shaped by generations who knew the land better than any map ever could. Near sunset, Luke noticed another sign. Fresh horse tracks. Not one rider. Several. His horse lifted its head uneasily. The surrounding silence changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Luke slowed his pace. He resisted the urge to reach for the revolver resting against his saddle. Every instinct told him he was no longer alone. The trail curved between two massive stone formations. Beyond them lay a broad valley washed in warm evening light. Smoke drifted peacefully above scattered lodges nestled beside a clear river. Children's laughter echoed faintly across the open meadow. Then everything stopped. Figures appeared soundlessly along the surrounding ridges. One after another. Men on horseback. Others standing among the rocks. Their expressions revealed neither anger nor welcome. Only caution. Luke counted 6. Then 10. Then more. None raised a weapon. None spoke. The valley itself seemed to be holding its breath. At the center of the path, one familiar figure stepped quietly forward. Aiyana. She wore the same simple buckskin dress, though the turquoise necklace around her neck now hung incomplete. Her eyes met Luke's. She noticed the small bead resting in his open palm. For the first time since they had met, a quiet smile touched her face. Not because he had found her, but because he had finally chosen to follow. The truth rarely waits at the end of a road. More often, it waits where no one is thought to look. No one spoke. The riders surrounding the valley remained perfectly still, their horses barely shifting beneath the fading light. Luke Harper kept both hands visible. His revolver stayed untouched. Every lesson the frontier had ever taught him urged caution, yet something about the silence before him felt different from fear. It felt disciplined. Aiyana stepped forward until only a few yards separated them. Her eyes settled on the turquoise bead resting in Luke's open palm. Without a word, he held it toward her. She accepted it gently. The broken leather cord slipped through her fingers as though it had finally returned home. For the first time, she spoke. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet, soft enough that the breeze nearly carried it away. Luke nodded. "I figured it belonged to you." It did. Neither of them said anything more. Instead, Aiyana turned and began walking deeper into the valley. After a brief hesitation, Luke followed. The riders moved aside without being asked. Children peeked curiously from behind cottonwood trees. An elderly woman smiled faintly while stirring a pot over an open fire. Several young men watched Luke carefully, though none reached for a weapon. The place felt nothing like the stories told in Dry Creek. There was no camp preparing for war. No hidden army. Only families finishing the ordinary work of another evening. The smell of cedar smoke drifted gently through the air. Dogs slept beneath wagons. A little boy chased a butterfly across the grass before his mother quietly called him back. Luke looked around in silence. The valley was alive with simple things. Things no rumor had ever mentioned. Aiyana led him toward the northern edge of the settlement, where towering cottonwood trees formed a quiet circle overlooking the river. The sounds of the village slowly faded behind them. There, beneath the oldest tree, stood several weathered wooden markers. No elaborate carvings. No grand monuments. Only names. Lives remembered with dignity. Luke slowed. Something about the place demanded silence. Aiyana stopped before one particular grave. She stepped aside. Luke's eyes settled on the faded wooden cross. His breathing stopped. The name carved into the weathered wood had almost disappeared beneath the passing years. Still, he could read every letter. Thomas Harper. His father. Luke stared without moving. No. The word barely escaped his lips. His father had disappeared more than 20 years earlier. The town believed he had died crossing the mountains. No body had ever been found. No grave had ever been marked. Luke had grown up believing the frontier itself had swallowed him. His knees weakened. He stepped closer. His trembling fingers brushed the worn wood. The carved letters were real. The grave was real. The impossible stood quietly before him beneath the evening sky. How? Luke whispered. Aiyana remained silent. An older man approached from behind the trees. His long gray hair rested against a simple buckskin shirt, and time had etched countless lines across his calm face. The people nearby lowered their heads respectfully as he passed. He stopped beside Luke. "My name is Takoda," he said gently. "I knew your father." Luke slowly looked up. Takota's eyes carried neither pity nor judgment, only memory. He came here during a winter when hunger nearly destroyed our people. Luke struggled to breathe. He was alive? For many years. Takota nodded toward the quiet river flowing beside the cemetery. He did not arrive as our enemy. The old man's gaze rested on Thomas Harper's grave. He arrived as the man who refused to let our children die. Luke felt the world beneath him shift. Every story he had believed since childhood suddenly seemed uncertain. The grave beneath the cottonwoods held more than his father's name. It held an entire past that someone had kept hidden. And Luke understood, with growing certainty, that Aiyana had not been visiting his ranch to ask for anything. She had been keeping a promise that began long before either of them had spoken their first word. Every promise costs something. The only question is who will pay the debt when it comes due. The evening settled gently over the valley. Golden light filtered through the cottonwood branches, painting long shadows across Thomas Harper's grave. Luke remained standing before the weathered cross. His father's name still felt impossible beneath his fingertips. Takota waited patiently beside him. Old men who carry truth rarely hurry to tell it. Finally, Luke found his voice. If he lived here, why didn't he come home? Takota looked toward the quiet river. Because some journeys leave no road back. The old chief knelt beside the grave and brushed away a layer of fallen leaves. Your father arrived during the hardest winter our people had ever known. Game had disappeared. Snow buried the mountains. Children were dying before spring. Luke listened without moving. He brought flour from the trading post. Takota smiled faintly. Then he returned with blankets. A pause. Then medicine. Another pause. And when he had nothing left to give, the old man rested one weathered hand upon the grave. He gave us his own horse so our hunters could reach the distant valleys. Luke lowered his eyes. He remembered that horse. His father had spoken about it when Luke was very young. He had simply said it was lost crossing the mountains. Nothing more. The traders accused him of helping enemies, Takota continued. The settlers stopped trusting him. They believed he had betrayed his own people. Luke felt his chest tighten. My father never told anyone. Takota nodded slowly. He believed kindness loses its value the moment it asks to be remembered. The words settled heavily between them. Aiyana stepped beside the grave. Around her neck, the repaired turquoise necklace rested quietly against her buckskin dress. My grandmother was one of the children he saved, she said softly. Luke turned toward her. He carried her through a snowstorm when she could no longer walk. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected memories passed from one generation to another. Without him, I would never have been born. Silence returned. Only the river continued speaking. Luke suddenly understood every morning she had stood outside his ranch. Every loaf of bread, every bundle of herbs, every bottle of water. She had never been repaying a favor to him. She had been honoring a debt owed to a man who could no longer receive it. My father asked you to do this. Aiyana slowly shook her head. No. Then why? She looked toward the fading light beyond the valley. Because gratitude should not be buried with the dead. The simple answer struck harder than any accusation ever could. Luke closed his eyes. Back in Dry Creek, people spoke endlessly about justice, about loyalty, about honor. Yet the greatest act of honor his father had ever shown had been hidden from the world for over 20 years. Footsteps interrupted the quiet. A young Apache rider approached at full speed. His horse was breathing hard. Dust covered his clothes. He stopped before Takota and spoke rapidly in his own language. The old chief's calm expression slowly faded. Several warriors nearby immediately turned toward the western ridge. The peaceful valley changed in an instant. Not into panic, into readiness. Takota looked toward Luke. There is trouble. What happened? The sheriff. The old man's voice remained steady. He is riding this way. Luke frowned. Why? One of the younger riders answered before Takota could. Someone from Dry Creek followed your tracks. Luke's heart sank. He looked back toward the distant hills beyond the valley. He suddenly saw the danger with painful clarity. Sheriff Nolan Briggs had not come searching for one missing cowboy. He believed he had discovered an Apache camp, and men who rode across the frontier carrying fear seldom arrived carrying peace. The loudest battles are often won by the first person willing to lower his hands instead of raising them. The warning spread through the valley like wind across dry grass. No shouting followed. No panic. Men quietly saddled horses. Women gathered children closer to the lodges. Cooking fires were covered to keep smoke from rising into the evening sky. Every movement was calm, practiced, almost sorrowfully familiar. Luke Harper watched in silence. "How many men?" he asked. The young rider answered, "More than 20. Sheriff Nolan Briggs. Deputies. Several ranchers from Dry Creek. Enough rifles to turn fear into tragedy." Luke looked toward Dakota. "They think they've found a war camp." Dakota nodded once. "They will see only what fear tells them to see." Luke knew he was right. Back in town, no one had ever spoken about families living beside this river. No one had mentioned children chasing butterflies or old women tending soup over open fires. People remembered stories. Stories were easier than truth. Aiyana stepped beside Luke. "If they enter the valley like frightened men." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Luke looked around. Young Apache riders waited near the ridge. Their bows remained lowered, but their eyes stayed fixed on the western trail. One frightened trigger. One misunderstanding. That was all the frontier usually needed. Luke reached for the reins of his horse. "I'm going to meet them." Several warriors immediately objected. "It is too dangerous. They won't listen. They may think you've been captured." Luke climbed into the saddle. "If I stay here, they'll never know the difference." Dakota studied him quietly. The old chief finally stepped forward. From beneath his buckskin coat, he removed a small leather pouch. Inside rested a folded piece of weathered paper. "The last letter your father wrote." Luke accepted it carefully. The paper felt impossibly fragile. He asked that it be given to his family. Dakota's voice carried quiet regret. "We never found them." Luke tucked the letter safely inside his jacket. "I'll bring it home." Whether he believed those words himself, he could not tell. He turned his horse toward the western ridge. Aiyana reached gently for his sleeve. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said only 4 words. "Come back alive, Luke." It was the first time she had ever spoken his name. He offered the smallest smile. "I'll try." The climb toward the ridge felt longer than the ride into the valley. The evening sun burned low against the horizon. Dust floated through the golden light. Halfway up the trail, Luke heard them. Horse hooves, many of them, metal jingling against saddles. Voices carried by the wind. Then he saw Sheriff Briggs leading the column. 23 riders. Every rifle rested within easy reach. The sheriff spotted Luke first. His horse slowed sharply. "Harper." Relief flashed across his weathered face. Then confusion. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" Luke rode forward alone until only a few yards separated them. "They're not your enemy." Several ranchers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them spat into the dust. "They've got you fooled." Luke shook his head. "No." Another rider pointed toward the distant smoke barely visible above the trees. "They're hiding down there." Luke looked each man in the eye. "They're living down there." The distinction hung heavily in the evening air. No one answered. Sheriff Briggs narrowed his eyes. "Move aside." Luke remained exactly where he was. His horse stood quietly across the narrow trail. The sheriff's expression hardened. "Luke." His voice became colder. "Are you standing with Dry Creek?" A long silence settled between them. "Or are you standing with the Apache?" The valley waited behind him. The town waited before him. For the first time in his life, Luke Harper understood that one honest answer could change far more than his own fate. Sometimes a single man standing still can stop an army already in motion. The narrow trail disappeared into silence. Sheriff Nolan Briggs waited for Luke's answer. Behind him, 23 armed riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. Behind Luke, hidden beyond the ridge, waited an entire village praying they would never need to defend themselves. The wind carried only dust. Luke slowly looked at every familiar face. Men he had traded with. Men who had helped raise barns. Men who had shared coffee around winter fires. Fear had changed them, not into monsters, into strangers. Finally, Luke spoke. "I'm standing with the truth." The words landed harder than a shouted command. One rancher laughed bitterly. "They've poisoned your mind." Another reached toward his rifle. Sheriff Briggs lifted one hand, stopping him. "What truth?" the sheriff asked quietly. Luke took a slow breath. "There are families in that valley. Women, children, old people. No war camp. No raiding party. Only people trying to live." Someone farther back scoffed. "That's exactly what they'd want you to believe." Luke reached inside his coat. Instantly several rifles rose. His hand emerged holding only a weathered letter. My father wrote this. The sheriff frowned. Your father died 20 years ago. So everyone believed. Luke carefully unfolded the fragile paper. The edges trembled in the evening breeze. His father's handwriting had faded, but the words remained. He read them aloud. If kindness costs me my place among my own people, then so be it. A hungry child does not become less worthy because of the blood in his veins. Silence spread across the trail. Luke continued, I hope one day my son learns that a man's character is measured by the lives he protects, not by the enemies he claims. His voice faltered. The final sentence was barely louder than a whisper. If he ever finds this letter, tell him I chose peace while I still could. Luke lowered the paper. No one moved. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat. Slowly, respectfully. I knew your father. His voice had softened. He was the finest man I ever rode beside. Luke nodded. He still is. The sheriff stared toward the hidden valley. His jaw tightened. Years of old stories fought against the evidence before him. Then another movement caught everyone's attention. Aiyana appeared on the ridge. She walked alone. No weapon rested in her hands. Instead, she carried a small bundle of white prairie flowers gathered from the valley below. Step by step, she crossed the open ground separating both sides. No warrior followed her. No rider moved to stop her. When she reached Luke, she quietly placed the flowers into his hands. They belong to your father. That was all she said. Luke turned. Together, he and Aiyana walked toward the old cottonwood overlooking the valley. Every rifle remained, pointed toward the ground. Sheriff Briggs watched them disappear over the ridge. Several long moments passed. Then the old lawman drew a deep breath. He looked back at the men behind him. No one fires. One rancher protested. But Sheriff, I said no one fires. His voice carried the weight of years spent burying too many sons. If anyone shoots today, he paused. It won't be under my badge. One by one, rifles lowered. Leather creaked. Horse heads relaxed. The valley remained silent. Then, from beyond the ridge, a small Apache child cautiously stepped into view. He could not have been older than 6. He held nothing except a carved wooden horse. He looked curiously at the strangers. A rancher's daughter, riding beside her father, quietly smiled. Without thinking, she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a bright red apple. She rolled it gently across the dusty trail. The little boy hesitated. Then he picked it up. No words were exchanged. No treaties were signed. No victory was declared. Yet in that fading light, while two children looked at one another without the burden of old hatred, something far greater than a battle came quietly to an end. The greatest changes never announce themselves. They simply arrive one quiet morning, and the world is no longer the same. Autumn settled gently over Dry Creek. The cottonwoods along the river had begun turning gold, their leaves drifting lazily across empty roads and weathered boardwalks. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Cattle moved through the valley. Children chased each other outside the schoolhouse. The saloon filled each evening with tired ranchers telling stories that grew taller after every drink. Yet one story quietly disappeared. No one spoke anymore about the Apache camp preparing for war, because no war had ever come. Sheriff Nolan Briggs never explained why. He simply told the town there had been a misunderstanding. Some accepted it. Others grumbled. Most eventually moved on. Luke Harper did not. Every few days, he rode beyond the western ridge carrying flour, tools, nails, or seed. Sometimes he returned with woven blankets. Sometimes with fresh herbs that grew nowhere near his ranch. The road between the valley and Dry Creek slowly stopped feeling like a border. It became a path. One crisp morning, Luke repaired the fence surrounding his father's forgotten ranch house. The front gate leaned crookedly beneath years of neglect. He worked alone until he heard quiet footsteps behind him. He did not turn immediately. By now, he already knew who walked softly enough not to disturb the birds. Aiyana stood beside the old apple tree. In her hands rested another small bundle. Luke smiled. More bread. She shook her head. This one is different. She unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a small wooden carving. A horse. Its shape was simple, its details worn smooth by careful hands. Luke recognized it immediately. The little boy. Aiyana nodded. He made it. Luke held the carving carefully. He wanted me to have this. He said the man who stopped the guns should never forget the day the guns stayed silent. Luke looked at the tiny wooden horse for a long moment. No expensive gift could have carried greater weight. He slipped it into his pocket beside the folded letter from his father. The two objects rested together, one from the past, one from the future. The wind carried the scent of drying grass across the open prairie. Luke looked toward Aiyana. I spent years wondering why you came to my ranch. She smiled gently. I wondered how long it would take before you asked. He laughed quietly. I wasn't very observant. No. She looked toward the distant hills glowing beneath the afternoon sun. You were grieving someone you had not yet found. The words settled softly between them. Luke understood. He had spent years mourning the absence of his father. Only after discovering the truth had he finally begun meeting the man his father had truly been. Not through memories, through choices. Aiyana glanced toward the repaired fence. Your father always believed broken things deserved another chance. Luke rested one hand against the weathered wood. So do I. Neither of them spoke again. They simply stood together while the prairie wind wandered through the tall grass. In the distance, children laughed somewhere beyond the ridge. The sound carried freely, across land that had once expected only echoes of gunfire. Luke reached into his pocket and touched both keepsakes. The faded letter, the carved wooden horse. One reminded him where kindness began. The other reminded him where it continued. He finally looked at Aiyana, not as the mysterious woman everyone feared, not as the stranger who had waited silently outside his ranch, but as the person who had carried his father's promise across 2 decades without asking for recognition. And in that quiet afternoon beneath an endless western sky, Luke realized that the greatest inheritance his father had left him was never land, cattle, or a family name. It was the courage to see another human being before seeing the stories told about them. Years pass across the frontier the way wind passes through prairie grass. Quietly, patiently, leaving behind only what was strong enough to remain. Many winters came after the day no one fired. Children who had watched from opposite sides of the ridge grew into men and women who no longer remembered why they had once been taught to fear each other. The trail between Dry Creek and the valley widened beneath wagon wheels instead of war horses. Some mornings, Apache families traded woven blankets for flour and iron tools. Other mornings, ranchers crossed the river carrying fresh milk or seed for spring planting. No treaty had ever been signed. No governor had ever visited. No newspaper had written a single line about what had happened there. Yet peace endured, perhaps because it had never belonged to politicians. It belonged to ordinary people who had simply grown tired of burying the innocent. Luke Harper grew older. The lines around his eyes deepened beneath countless seasons of sun and dust. His ranch prospered, though he never became the richest man in Dry Creek. That had stopped mattering years earlier. Every Sunday morning, before beginning his work, he rode to the old cottonwood overlooking the valley. 2 graves rested beneath its branches. One belonged to Thomas Harper. Beside it, after many peaceful years had passed, another simple marker appeared. Dakota. The old chief had left the world as quietly as he had lived within it. Luke never visited one grave without stopping at the other. He always carried fresh wildflowers. Sometimes Aiyana was already there. Neither of them spoke much. Silence had become its own language. One spring afternoon, several children followed Luke through the valley. One little girl pointed toward Thomas Harper's grave. Who was he? Luke looked down at the child. He could have answered in many ways. My father. A rancher. A traveler. Instead, he smiled. He was a man who fed hungry children. The girl nodded as though that explained everything. Perhaps it did. Years later, when Luke himself felt the weight of old age settling into his bones, Sheriff Nolan Briggs came to visit the ranch. The sheriff's hair had turned completely white. He carried no badge anymore. Retirement had softened the stern lines across his face. The 2 old men sat on the porch as evening painted the prairie gold. After a long silence, Briggs spoke. You know? He stared toward the western horizon. I almost ordered my men to fire that day. Luke looked at him quietly. I know. The sheriff lowered his head. I've wondered for years how many lives would have ended because I believed a story instead of looking for the truth. Luke poured coffee into 2 worn tin cups. We all inherit stories. He handed one cup to the old lawman. The important part is deciding which ones deserve to survive. Briggs smiled sadly. I wish I'd learned that younger. So do most men. The sun slowly disappeared behind the distant hills. Neither spoke again. There was nothing left that required words. Long after both men were gone, travelers crossing the frontier occasionally asked why the trail between Dry Creek and the Apache Valley was still called Harper's Crossing. Most received different answers. Some believed it honored a rancher. Others believed it remembered an old family. Only a handful knew the truth. The name marked the place where one man chose compassion over fear, where one woman carried gratitude across 20 forgotten years, where children inherited peace instead of hatred. Out on the western frontier, justice never arrived with the fastest draw or the loudest gun. It arrived quietly, in a loaf of bread left before sunrise, in a turquoise bead returned to its rightful owner, in a faded letter preserved through decades of silence, in a carved wooden horse passed from one child to another, and in the simple courage to see a human soul before seeing the color of its skin, the language of its people, or the stories told about its name. Because beyond every frontier worth crossing, the land was never waiting to be conquered. Only the human heart was.